So as to why this weird book about giant spiders from outer space became the book that my entire career is based on, I couldn't tell you.
Today, I have the great pleasure of speaking with international sensation Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is such a treat for me personally, Adrian, because I've been reading your books for years. Rightly, you are considered one of the best speculative fiction writers out there. And honestly, I never expected you to respond when I emailed you, but you did, and here we are. So it's such a pleasure to have you here with us today. Thank you.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you.
So I first encountered you, as I'm sure many people did, with your first sci-fi novel, Children in Time, which I absolutely loved. It's one of my favorite, modern sci-fi books of all time. But one of the other things that always attracted my interest was your obnoxiously Russian name. And as a as a scion of Russian immigrants from the White Army that went through China, I'm always picking up cues like this, and I love it how there's always elements of Russian culture, language, and things like this that appear randomly in your books. So I thought,
I should absolutely say this is not the way my name is normally spelled. The name on the books uses a familiar transliteration from the composer, but my background is actually Polish rather than Russian. If that.
Oh, okay.
So if you want to kick me off for that, then
no, that's it. We're done. This conversation's over. So your background's Polish, but there's plenty of little nods to Slavic culture and Slavic language. So do you speak Polish? Do you speak Russian?
I speak about 3 words of Polish and 0 words of Russian. No, I mean, I am second generation UK born.
Okay. But is the Slavic culture something that is that something that's consciously comes through your work? Are you putting those things in there on purpose, or do they just filter in?
Yeah, there's always a certain, I mean, I suspect that given my distance from it, it's a rather romanticized version that doesn't bear much close examination, but I think it's definitely a part of my sort of personal identity. I think that just that I have that kind of that extra bonus heritage to draw on.
Yes, that you don't need to talk about, but it's there, and it spices things up a little bit. It's in particular, I mean, in your latest series, not your latest series, but the one that you recently finished, the Lords of Uncreation. I appreciated that the bad guys were who would traditionally be the bad guys in Russian epic poetry, the boyarin, which I thought was a wonderful little dig there and now that I understand that you spell it in the Polish way, I appreciate it even more. Children in Time, the Children of Time was a remarkable book, and it won a bunch of awards, and I only recently realized that it's your first science fiction. So how is it that you managed to strike gold so quickly on your first try, as it were?
Oh Lord, I mean, if I knew that, I'd bottle it, wouldn't I?
That's right.
I have absolutely no idea. I was kind of a modestly successful fantasy author. I had written a great big fantasy series and was writing a few more. I have a science background and I grew up reading sci-fi stories, so I thought I would like to write a sci-fi story. Specifically, I want to write a sci-fi story about spider evolution because that's one of my interests. I had come across this rather fascinating research.
I'll take care of that.
Yeah. And so I somehow sold my publisher, who was very much with the idea that I was going to keep on writing fantasy stories for the foreseeable future, that I would get out this one sci-fi book as a bit of a punt, and they humored me on it, and basically we got a contract with a very, very small advance, and the understanding was that I would get back to the swords and the. It took about a year for it to do anything. So initially, it made 0 splash. I suspect it probably didn't get a great deal of publicity.
Right.
And then it got picked up. Yeah, and then it got picked up by the Clark Awards and got shortlisted. And at that point, it just snowballed and hasn't really stopped. So as to why this weird book about giant spiders from outer space became the book that my entire career is based on, I couldn't tell you. I'm still kind of trying to see if I can repeat the experience.
So they were hoping that you would get it out of your system and get back to the
That was certainly the general impression I got. And
dude.
also, I mean, I don't know quite how it is in the States, but in the UK, fantasy is a much, much bigger market than science fiction. So
No, it is
pitching
here as well.
publishers in a science fiction book is much more difficult.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's definitely the case. So in terms of you being picked up by the Clarks, is that something that somebody had to submit for you, or did it just happen largely by accident?
The books are submitted. The Clark Award is a juried. It's unusual in that it's an entirely juried award, meaning all of the books that are submitted are read by all of the judges before they produce the shortlist.
Oh wow.
Which is a colossal amount of work, given that they get well over 100 books a year submitted.
Oh, wow.
But the larger publishers tend to submit books fairly liberally. You frequently get a lot of stuff on the long list, which is patently not the sort of book that is ever going to get anywhere with that award.
Mm-hmm.
But it's genre, and therefore it just kind of gets bunged in. But I mean, in all honesty, Children of Time was definitely that sort of book from the start, because it's that kind of it deals with big issues, and it is also kind of science fiction of a particular kind of stripe, and that there are sort of 3 or 4 particular sort of subgenral buckets that tend to turn up again and again in the Clark's shortlists.
Okay. You mentioned that you had an interest in spider biology. Is that a professional interest, or is it a casual one?
Oh, I should be so lucky. I've always been fascinated by insects and spiders and things like that. And whilst I do have a background in the biological sciences, it never went far enough for me to become a professional. I read the research, and every so often the research gives me something that I can sort of pull on to make a sort of weave a fantasy or a science fiction plot out of. So yes, I mean, I'm kind of, it's not so much, it's not professional, it's not even really academic, but it's purely, I am personally extremely interested in just that general area of the animal kingdom.
It's fascinating to me that given your education, at least as far as I can tell, in the sciences, that you chose to start with fantasy as your genre of choice initially, when you could have perhaps earlier drawn on that expertise or that interest a little bit. Is there any reason you started off with fantasy as a genre?
I mean, I think most of the stuff I was reading, I think I was reading way more fantasy than sci-fi by that point. I don't think I was necessarily thinking of things on a commercial level, but certainly if I had been, then fantasy would have made a lot more sense.
Right.
As it is, there is a certain freedom to writing secondary world fantasy, I think, that makes it very, very enjoyable to do. And that was just where my focus was, I guess. And I was very lucky at the time, because it was this very narrow window in genre where the enormous fantasy series was the thing publishers were looking for. We had the Malazan books out, we had the early Song of Ice and Fire.
Yeah.
And suddenly that was the thing people wanted. They wanted epic and heroic fantasy, and they wanted the idea of a series that would run and run. And that window didn't honestly last that long. It lasted maybe 4 or 5 years in the UK before there was quite a contraction. But I hit that moment when that sort of series of books was exactly what people were looking for.
And which series was that? What was your first series?
Oh, that was Shadows of the Apt. So that ran to 10 books in the UK, and it's been reissued since, and they've had an audio release and all that fun stuff. When it came out in the States, it got 5 books in and then kind of just died a death.
Oh, really?
Oh God, yeah. No, it did not do terribly well in the US at all. I think you can now get it because because of the re-release, but at the time they came out, the books had quite a different cover and branding, and for whatever reason they just kind of vanished away into the ether. And that was kind of my first shot at being published in the States. I didn't get another book in the States for many, many years after that.
Was it Children of Time that got you back in?
Not even that, weirdly enough. I ended up getting in with Tor.com.
Yeah.
And I did a few books for them that, I did a book called Spiderlight, which I think is also getting a reissue, which again completely died.
Mm-hmm.
I then did some novellas for them, which did pretty well, the Expert Systems books. And then I did Elder Race. And again, for reasons I couldn't particularly explain, Elder Race did extremely well. Everyone, it suddenly hit the radars. It clicked with people for whatever reason, and suddenly that then obviously brought me to the notice of a lot of readers in the US who hadn't previously been aware of me. And after that was really what started the ball rolling. And then I think within about a year of that, we got a very, very belated US release of the children books. And since then, Orbit has brought out the Final Architecture series, and Bloomsbury are now doing some of my fantasy in the States. And so that I'm getting now quite a lot out, sort of over your side of the Atlantic.
Yeah. So Elder Race, that's I mean, the cover always stands out for me whenever it shows up in my recommendations on Amazon. I haven't read it yet.
Sorry, I lost you there for a second. Can you say that again?
Sure. Elder Race always stands out to me because the cover is so strong in Amazon's recommendations and things like that. So I see that there all the time. I didn't realize it's a novella though. Is that right? It's a novella.
It is, yeah. Yeah, it's one of the things I absolutely love Tor.com for is the fact that they kind of brought back the novella as a viable form, because I love writing to that length. And yes, yeah, it's almost my Gene Wolfe homage novella in a way. It's I wanted to write a book which was simultaneously a heroic fantasy and a hard science fiction sort of novel, without favoring either perspective. And there is a Gene Wolfe story, in fact, possibly I think his first published story, Trip Trap, which does that beautifully, and that was very much my model.
So you're a Gene Wolfe fan. Well, you're
Oh, good Lord, yes.
It's these days there's not that many people that still mention him, but it's wonderful to hear that people are still reading him. I can't get enough of him. Speaking of your writing from the perspective of a heroic fantasy, but coming in sort of in the age of the anti-hero, the Malazan books and the Song of Ice and Fire and things like this. Do you feel as an author any particular draw towards writing either hero or anti-hero?
It's an interesting one. I don't tend to do the full Grimdark thing. I tend to have a little more hero to my heroes, but on the other hand, I think that school of writing gave the fantasy genre a lot of very, very welcome sort of character complexity and just interesting places to go that I feel a lot of the traditional big fantasies from, say, the 80s didn't really have. There's a lot of quite flat characterization there. There is just like, it's a series of events and they fight this and they fight that and they go here and they go there and the bad guys are bad and the good guys are good. And the reader is not at any point particularly put to make it to really have any thoughts or make any decisions. You just kind of sit there and eat popcorn and watch. Sure. Whereas when you get things like, for example, Joe Abercrombie or Scott Lynch, you have some very complex and interesting characters, and it doesn't necessarily mean they're all horrible people. That is true in some books, but in other books they're frequently, or in Abercrombie's case, they're horrible people who are also enormously fun to spend time with.
Right.
But it kind of feels that they're the whole extra dimension to both the world and the characters that the dominant sort of heroic fantasy sort of model didn't really draw on much.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think about this perhaps a little too much, but it's interesting to hear you put it that way. Would you then agree with someone like George Martin, who tends to put this negative or limited quality of so-called traditional fantasy at the door of it being sort of Tolkien's um, excessive moralization, as George R. R. Martin would have it, or is it something else? I'm just curious about your
I mean,
opinion on that.
it's interesting because I mean, I am certainly by no means the greatest Tolkienista in the world, but I think that's probably a bit unfair because
I think it is.
I think both in the complexity of his world and in the complexity of at least some of his characters, say Boromir or Gollum, for example, there's a lot more going on in Tolkien than is going on in those who are kind of borrowing the trappings of Tolkien to create that early sort of boom of heroic fantasy that you had
I
in the
love that
late
you're not
70s.
saying the heirs of Tolkien, because that's right. They're the ones who borrow the trappings. I think that's very well said.
Well, this is yeah, but it's one of those. So if you look at the worlds there, they are frequent. They are not. I mean, not that many people really put that level of detail that Tolkien did because
Yeah,
Tolkien was far more interested in the worlds than the books.
right.
But they don't tend to have any of that. They have the outward show
Yes.
without any of the inward logic that led to it a lot of the time.
Yeah, right. So the thing that ends up falling by the wayside then is the kind of nuance that you get in the rise of Grimdark. But then the Grimdark, I personally think, tended to go a little bit too far in the other direction in um, prioritizing a kind of nihilistic view of the
Yeah,
world
and
that didn't
well,
allow for
one of
heroism.
the big things I think once it becomes very popular and everyone is doing Grimdark, one of the things that people lose sight of very quickly is early Grimdark tends to work because a lot of it is very funny.
That's true. Yeah, Abercrombie. It's very
And
clear in Abercrombie. Yeah.
Abercrombie and Lynch is
Yes.
extremely funny. All of that. And what that does is it means that the bad stuff has a lot of seasoning.
Yeah.
And KJ Parker is another one. A lot of KJ Parker is extremely funny. And at the same time, it can be very, very bleak.
Yeah.
And if you take the humor out and you just say, "Oh, this is this dreadful world, and there are terrible people, and all the people are terrible, and they're all doing terrible things to each other," for 400 pages, that's a slog to read in exactly the way as lovely people doing lovely things and going on a lovely quest for 400 pages can also be a bit of a slog to read. It's because someone is feeding you a large mass or one flavor of thing.
That's so true. That's very good.
And
Yeah.
so, and I to a certain extent, when I am writing, say, a very, very bleak dystopia, like Service Model or like One Day All This Will Be Yours, I make it as funny as possible because that makes it digestible. And that makes it a much, much more enjoyable reading experience for the people who are otherwise just watching a catalogue of atrocities.
Yeah, and I mean, it occurs to me that some of the other early Grimdark books, like Malazan, work not necessarily because of the comedy in that sense, but because, and not only because of the unrelenting grimness, but because it's stylistically so different. So there's always some element to it that draws the attention away from the atrocities and towards something about the actual story.
Well, you're frequently focusing with the Malazan books. It is possibly the most epic of epic fantasy series in scale, but many of the books focus entirely on small groups of extremely relatable characters who are often they're a lot of fun to be around. He's very, very good with that kind of instant characterization. Which, given he's got about 1 million characters in that series, is really quite a feat.
Well, and that's what you do. It occurs to me in Lords of Uncreation in particular, because it's a different kind of epicness, right? Because it's not an epicness of creating a secondary world, but it is the epicness of scale, of having a planet-sized sentience that you have to somehow be able to relate to from a human scale, which you do very intelligently, I think, by having the psionic powers in the sort of genetically adapted humans. But the thing that really is remarkable about that series, and the thing that I think makes it readable all the way through, or one of the things, is that other thing. It's the fact that you're with some spectacularly fun characters to be around with. So is that something you were consciously trying to think about in terms of doing it like Malazan, maybe?
I don't think I was thinking of it in a Malazan way. I mean, but it is I think you're right in that it's marrying two particular ways of doing sci-fi, in that it's the enormous sort of space object, great big, it's the Ian Banks culture stuff.
Yep.
It's all of that thing, wherever you're dealing with things, this thing destroys planets, or this thing is fundamentally linked to the structure of the universe, all of that kind of enormous, the Peter Hamilton kind of Night's Dawn trilogy sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And at the same time, your central group of characters are basically, they are like the crew of in Farscape or Blake Seven or Firefly or The Expanse. They are that small group of relatively ordinary people who just, through utter misfortune, find themselves at the center of these colossal scale events, and nobody else is around to save the universe but them. And they bicker and they argue and they fall out and they do heroic things, and it's all happening at that very, very relatable sort of found family, regular person scale. And it at the outer teeth of which it's meshing with these colossal cosmic events.
Not just cosmic events, but also sort of mythological realities that you start to get into, especially in the third book, where all kinds of interesting resonances are happening on multiple levels, where you're getting into cosmology, you're getting into how people relate to their deep past, how they relate to the idea of the origins of the cosmos, what might be at the source of it, why do we exist, all these huge questions, which are not surprisingly answered by using a lot of interesting archetypal type of imagery, while also still rooting it in what is at heart a story about found family. Is that, again, this might be a repeat of the question, but how much of that for you in writing that particular story was something that happened in the process of writing, and how much of it was something you thought about consciously before you got into the actual writing?
So I always start off with a lot of world building with all of my work. So the majority of the universal setup was there, the different alien species, the political factions, all of that stuff. A lot of the personal scale development kind of arose out of the books, especially as you go on through the series. So the first book is fairly planned out, but then the second book has a lot of stuff which just turned up incidentally or is feeding off things that I had in the first book. Mm-hmm. Some characters I thought were going to be minor become major because I just enjoyed working with them so much.
Yeah.
And so I think, and I suspect this is probably common with a lot of series, it kind of spirals away from that initial plan to a certain extent, but it's always at least going off in that right same general trajectory that I planned.
Did you, I mean, this is a bit of spoiler material for those who haven't read it, but I'll try to be discreet. Did you have an idea of who the masters of the architects were when you started writing book one?
Yes. I mean, I think from that's the sort of level of planning that I find I have to do. Mm-hmm. And certainly when I read a book, there are a number of times I've been reading a book and it's become clear to me, at least, that the author hasn't set that underlying "this is what is going on" question at the beginning. Mm-hmm. And it does tend to mean that you think back and you say, all right, this is great, but why did this and this and this? It's like the Lost sort of thing. It's like there's a whole bunch of things that then kind of, they seem to be really exciting at the time, but then they appear, looking back, you can like, well, none of that really made a great deal of sense. It was a lot of style, but there was the substance that was kind of promised didn't seem to underlie it. So I need that skeleton to build on, which also, I mean, it has, as purely on writing technique, it has the very, very useful side effect of meaning my edits before I submit are much lighter because everything is already tied together.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the visual cues that you offer the reader, such as they are, because they're limited as they would have to be for a race as ancient and as difficult to relate to as the originators, did you have any, what were your cues visually when you were thinking about what they might look like?
Well, this is the thing, because I don't think we ever find out what they look like, because I don't think they look like anything, because they don't exist in a physical sense. They're an unspace thing. And so the only way they are being experienced is through the mental constructs of the people who are encountering them, and those are drawn entirely from their own nature, which is why when you see different characters encounter them, they are basically described in different ways. Their main
That's true.
feature is they always.
That's true. But at the same time, what I would say is that because Idris sees them first, and his mental construct of them is quite specific. I think what the readers encounter with them is in some way privileged by that initial mental image, which is a very strong one and very interesting one. And everything that happens after that, you understand how they work as a species, so to speak. But you still keep on some level in your mind that initial visual imagery. So let's ask the question differently. When Idris sees them, what is it that he's seeing? What's the visual cue that you're taking to help create his vision of the originators?
So it's I mean, I guess the things that carry over, what they are projecting is age and authority. So, and it's an age that is, it's an age that is greater than the age of the universe. It is that kind of, though it's ruins and it's dust and it's bones, but at the same time, I mean, Idris is a character who has a lot of problems with authority figures, mostly because they are constantly attempting to possess him for what he can do. And so he's kind of predisposed to kick back against that. So you have him responding to them as if they are kind of like the Boyarin, the space barons, who have that kind of innate sense of their own superiority over everyone else because they are a kind of a hereditary noble class. And then later on, you have characters responding to them as if they are kind of military officers or judicial authority figures or whatever, depending on their own frame of reference. But it's age and authority are really the constants that carry on through, I think.
That's interesting. I mean, it's interesting that I think you allow enough freedom in there in the visual representation, or the way that you describe them being represented visually in the experience of the characters, for the readers themselves to be able to sort of superimpose some images from their own experiences on top of it. For myself in particular, I guess it was just specific enough for me to, for some reason, I saw, I don't know if you've ever seen these illustrations, but in the old Narnia books, Pauline Bain's original illustrations of the god Tash from the last battle.
Yeah.
For some reason, I very strongly saw that picture as Idris was watching the originators.
I mean, it may well, I mean, honestly, that I know the image you mean. And Lord knows I certainly read those books avidly as a kid. And so that may well be feeding in there. And also there is kind of there's a Sumerian concept of the underworld as a place of kind of feathers and birds as being this kind of symbol of things that are long dead. And I suspect that always really hooked at my imagination. So I feel that's probably feeding in there as well and adding to that kind of vaguely bird-like sense of things,
which oddly fits really well with the rest of the sort of Sumerian flavor, with having, space being this great vast deep abyss of water and leviathans kind of floating around in there, which is of course, in terms of an old Near Eastern or biblical view of the world, it makes sense that birds and fish are associated with each other. So I thought that was that resonated very strongly with me. I like that a lot. One of the remarkable things about and I'm sure you see reactions like this all over the place, but much of them will be from arachnophobes who say, how can you possibly privilege the point of views of spiders over people? But was that how did you approach the difficult and possibly thorny question of allowing for the point of view of a sentient spider to be essentially preferred to the point of view of human beings?
I mean, that was the challenge, really. There's nothing people hate more than spiders in general. And so writing a book where at the end of it, people are rooting for the spiders in a conflict with humanity was what I wanted to do. I like spiders. I wanted to bring some of that to people. I suspect one of the reasons the book worked is that my own fondness for the subject matter comes through. But also, I think it really helps that you're seeing them from inside. It helps, that I'm not kind of deluging you with sort of arachnophobia style descriptions of all the spiders doing spider things. You're seeing the spiders, you're seeing them strive and struggle and sort of face familiar problems that our own ancestors have faced and come through, and hopefully you become invested in them as a culture because they are basically, they get the hero role.
Yeah.
They get to triumph against all odds, against all the things that their social and evolutionary path can throw at them.
I mean, in some ways, it sounds like what you're saying is rather than take a hard sci-fi approach to the emerging sentience of a species that is not primate, you're essentially humanizing in a very deep way something that is not at all human, thereby in some ways injecting a kind of fantasy approach to writing sci-fi into something that could be viewed as hard sci-fi. What do you
I
think?
mean, I think these things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. But one of the things is if we see any kind of creature that is encountering a recognizable obstacle, a recognizable challenge, we are very, very good at empathizing with things.
Yeah.
So as you see like I don't know, a bee trying to get out of a window, you can feel the frustration of the bee. And obviously you're not genuinely doing so, but that's how our minds are set up. We do
right.
impose ourselves on anything. So it's really, it's very, very easy for me to set up this idea of, right, yes, here are the spiders. They are facing this colossal sort of ant invasion, and the ants have got sort of various innovations like flamethrowers and worked metal and all this sort of thing. And there are far fewer spiders, and their city's on fire, and they're all trying to get out, and it's all this proper kind of Siege of Minas Tirith thing going on with arthropods. And I think you'd have to have a heart of stone not to kind of get caught up in that kind of story, even though it is at the same time a situation I've arrived at by going quite methodically through what ifs to construct how these spiders have come about, how their world has come about. And it does also, it helps that there is a human hand involved in their uplift, which means that they are potentially becoming a more human thing than a random spider just allowed to evolve.
Well, that's, I mean, I'm going to push you a little bit on this because I think this is a really interesting idea. And that's that I think that you're right in saying that a spider civilization that has been uplifted specifically by humans would be more relatable and empathetic to a human than one that might emerge into a sentience that wasn't guided by a human hand. And I'm sorry, which part? Where did I stop?
You were saying that what a spider society that's been influenced by humans is going to evolve into something more identifiable,
much more identifiable, and it's something that the human beings can empathize with more easily, rather than a situation, a what if, in which the spiders came to a kind of emergent sentience that was not guided by humanity. I wonder what you think about this, but I wonder if that sort of emergent sentience would be so alien that the very universally human structures of overcoming obstacles and kind of going through a heroic struggle and heroic journey wouldn't even apply in that case. Or do you think this is something that is sort of objectively true?
This is something I've both given a lot of thought to and also written a lot on, because I've written quite a range of non-human societies and entities, ranging from the very closely sort of human-like through to hopefully the very, very alien. Mm-hmm. And obviously it's an area that can only ever be one of speculation because we have a single data point.
Sure, but it's fun to speculate.
But I kind of feel that there's almost like there are two poles of commonality that we could probably look to. If you have any kind of life that is involved in any kind of evolution, there are going to be certain useful instincts it picks up, such as self-preservation, because obviously if it doesn't have an instinct of self-preservation, there may not be much of it around for very long. That gives rise to drives like there are fear, there is hunger, and there's like a suite of emotions. I mean, I genuinely believe that a certain level of emotional intelligence evolves very, very early on, and that there is an emotional life going on in even relatively simple creatures. Because one of the things we are finding now, for example, with the Portia spider research that the book was based on, is that wherever you look for complexity in animal behavior, you find it in spades, in creatures that were previously thought to be far too simple to exhibit that kind of conduct.
Yeah.
And so that gives us a common start point, a common sort of basic toolkit that one might expect to find both in various other examples of Earth life, but also potentially with alien life. Because if you have any kind of biological commonality, you're going to have a certain, you need to get energy into your system. You need to get rid of stuff you don't want. You need to preserve yourself so that you can, by whatever means, reproduce your form of life. These things may not be absolute universals, but we could kind of expect to find them. Similarly, when you get a creature that is sufficiently complicated to observe the universe this creature is observing is the same one that we're observing. The basic logic of it, the element that it work are going to be the same, or at least that is a reasonable supposition anywhere across the universe. So that even if this creature has had a wildly different journey to get there, it is possible that we would have points of commonality with it that we could use to start a conversation. It is I do not in any way believe in the anthropic principle that the universe is going to give us humans, as I suspect most of my writing shows. But it is possible that whatever the universe gives us would at least have some overlap, purely because we are in the same universe. And I'm well aware that there are people who will absolutely argue the contrary to this very, very eloquently, and obviously it remains this enormous hypothetical.
I think it's a really fascinating way.
But also, if you're writing a science fiction book about aliens, unless the point of the story is that we literally cannot in any way identify with the aliens, you've got to have some way of starting that conversation.
No, of course. And in terms of storytelling, it's a necessary leap to make. But it's just fascinating. It's very interesting for me to hear you articulate it that way, because it sounds like, if I'm understanding you correctly, that what you're postulating is that the sort of objective reality of how the universe actually is, in some ways, in a lot of ways, will then determine the jump from mere deterministic behavior into something that might approximate heroism at some point, which is kind of the jump from the hard necessity of survival of the fittest for the purposes of reproduction into something approaching empathy. And you're suggesting, maybe, if I'm understanding you correctly, that something about the objectivity of the universe helps that jump happen. Is that right?
I don't know. I do, however, think that there isn't a hard line. I don't think there is a jump. I think there is a spectrum, because I think that when you're talking about philanthropy and heroism and self-sacrifice, there are certainly models whereby you can show that this is evolutionarily useful. So if you're looking just purely at the hard logic of, will it be useful if you have an instinct whereby every so often one example of the species will basically turn and hold off the wolves so the rest can run off, or whatever your particular local situation is. Or alternatively will lay its eggs and then considerately just die next to them so that the babies can eat it. Or will kind of descend in their thousands to attack a predator because they're all siblings of the same mother, like ants. All of these things have kind of an actual sort of genetic logic case anyway. We tend to think that there is something very special about the way we experience the world, and that we have these noble and extra feelings that put us above the animal kingdom. I don't personally believe that. I think that there is no hard dividing line between an ant sort of throwing itself at a predator that is invading its nest, through to a human, a firefighter going into a burning building to bring out a child. These are all, it's a big continuum, but it's a continuum. I think that a lot of the things we believe are uniquely human are part of a long-term development that's been going on for 500 million years, honestly.
That doesn't surprise me. It does come, that worldview does come through strongly in your writing. So then that begs the next question, and that's one that I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about. One of the things that I really liked about the second book in the Children of Time series is how you approach the kind of, it's somewhat tropey alien of the masked intelligence that comes in and kind of possesses the wills or the some, I don't know how you properly say it scientifically, of other sentient creatures, and how through much of the book it's the reader has a very strong reaction to this other as evil, but the ending suggests that the problem is that you equate other with evil. Do you think therefore that that leap can be made, the logical leap, that all evil then is just a matter of other? It can be overcome.
I think that would be an enormous simplification. I think evil is a very complicated thing. Evil is a very subjective thing. I think that there's the Terry Pratchett line that evil is to do with seeing people as things, and I think that is very strong, and that does very much tie into what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think that the other as evil is more of a prejudice thing. You're not even getting as far as necessarily seeing them as things. It's that idea of it's a thing that humans love to do, which is basically we love to have our fictional setup where there is a bad guy that is irrecoverable and irredeemable, and that you are basically permitted to kill thousands of. It's one reason why I think zombie settings are so phenomenally popular. It's it's why orcs, it's why the bugs in Starship Troopers, it's why robots, it's just that idea of, oh well, there are millions of them and we can kill them and that is fine, and there is no moral dimension to this. And that's very much what I'm pushing back with my own bugs and my own creatures, and just the idea of actually, just maybe from a purely human point of view, maybe othering other sentient beings into things it's fine to get rid of is maybe not a particularly classy move for humanity.
Yeah, and the fact that ultimately you allow the Nodites to recognize that sort of possessing the sentience or overcoming the sentience of another is essentially a step that they shouldn't take, and have them step away from it is a really it was a beautiful ending to one that I didn't actually expect. So I really appreciated that.